Hello, a very warm welcome to the Hellenic Center. I am Naya Yakumaki, Director of the Hellenic Center. Some of you will not know me as I embarked on this exciting role 3 months ago in September 2022. It is needless to say that I feel incredibly honored to be on the helm of the Hellenic Center after the retirement of the previous director, Mrs. Agatha Kalisperas, who is here tonight. We are very pleased to be hosting so many distinguished guests tonight. We have all gathered for a very special event, the Andreas A. David 10th Biennial Memorial Lecture, a lecture with guest speaker Bruce Clark, which commemorates one of the Hellenic Center's central founders, and in fact, the person who became the first chairman of the Hellenic Community Trust, a body which was set up in order to realize an ambitious dream shared by many other key founders, some of whom are here tonight. The Hellenic Center is the outcome of the great efforts by individuals, groups, and organizations, and it's due to their vision, passion, commitment, and dedication that we are here today and have reached almost 3 decades of successful operation. Soon, in 2024, we will be celebrating our 30th birthday. The Hellenic Center flourishes because of the generosity of its founders, supporters, and members, and I would like to take this opportunity to thank you all. I would now like to introduce our next speaker, Lady Marks. Lady Marks is the chairman of the Michael Marks Charitable Trust, a founding member of the Hellenic Center, and a permanent member of the Governing Council of the Center. Lady Marks, welcome. Please come on stage.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to tonight's biannual lecture established to commemorate our great benefactor and founding member of the Hellenic Center, Andrew David. This year, we are very fortunate to have as our speaker Bruce Clark, a journalist and writer of international renown. Bruce Clark's illustrious career spans more than 40 years. He worked for Reuters, the Financial Times, and the Times, with postings in Paris, Athens, Moscow, and Washington, before eventually returning to London in 1998 to join The Economist, writing about international security, European affairs, and religion, and finally becoming its editor until his retirement a couple of years ago. He still contributes articles to The Economist on a part-time basis, as well as to other newspapers. Bruce was born to an Anglo-Irish family in Northern Ireland at a time when serious tensions between the Anglo-Irish and Catholic communities made Northern Ireland a difficult place to live and grow up. He became a Greek scholar at the age of 9 and an ardent lover of anything Greek. Through his long involvement with Greece, he has acquired an astonishing knowledge of Greek history and culture and speaks Greek like a native, and I can vouch for that. Because of this intimate knowledge, he was asked by Reuters to become the first expatriate correspondent posted to Greece in 1982, a post he held for 4 years, and since then he continued to write and report on Greece, visiting the country frequently and making many long-lasting friendships. A related interest he developed already from his student years at Cambridge is the Greek Orthodox Church, which became a strong pole of attraction for him. He has been an active participant in the environmental initiatives of the Ecumenical Patriarchate, and after long preparation, finally in October 1996, he was received into the Orthodox Church. Following his conversion, and in recognition of his assistance to the ecumenical throne, especially in the field of the environment, in April 2018, he was honored by the Ecumenical Patriarch with the title of Archon Interpreter. Bruce is the author of 3 books. The first was An Empire's New Clothes, published in 1996, based on his intimate knowledge of Russia, as he was the Times foreign correspondent there during Russia's post-Soviet transition. His second book, Twice a Stranger, is an account of the Lausanne Convention on Population Exchange and its consequences for Greece and Turkey. It was a major success and came out in several editions, many languages, and won the Runciman Prize in 2007. In October 2021, he published his third book, Athens, City of Wisdom, a narrative history of the city from prehistoric times to the present day. Last September, he was awarded the Golden Cross of the Order of the Phoenix by the Greek government for services to Greek culture and history. It is the great knowledge he acquired while he was researching his second book, Twice a Stranger, that will be the main focus of his lecture tonight, as this year we are commemorating 100 years from the expulsion of the Greeks from their ancestral lands following the signing of the Treaty of Lausanne in 1923, which endorsed an exchange of populations between Greece and the Ottoman Empire, as it was then. The Treaty of Lausanne sealed the fates of millions of people on both sides of the newly drawn borders between Greece and the dying Ottoman Empire, who found themselves to be of the wrong religion in the wrong country. One historian looking at the Lausanne Treaty later wrote that Lausanne tacitly endorsed comprehensive policies of expulsion and extermination of hetero-ethnic and hetero-religious groups. Tonight's lecture is going to show us, in the inimitable style, knowledge, and erudition of Bruce Clark, both sides of the coin that was paid in order to create a modern state of Greece and the new state of the Republic of Turkey. Please welcome Bruce Clark.
Oh, what a flattering and touching introduction. I'll do my best to live up to it. One tiny correction is that I founding edited one section of The Economist, which was the new international news section. I wasn't quite the editor of the whole magazine, Makari. But anyway, yes, you promoted me. That's fine. That's fine. Well, yes, good. This is the first image that I wanted us to focus on this evening. In the course of the lecture, I'll be touching on high politics, high diplomacy, the politics of humanitarian aid, but I think it's always important to remember what the basic subject matter is, which is hundreds of thousands of ordinary people who were caught up in a process, in a transfer from one country to another, which was entirely beyond their control, and who didn't react to that process simply by acting as victims, but almost immediately on arriving in the new country, began to improve themselves, began to work to support themselves, to contribute to the new country. So it's an image of victimhood, but not of passivity. That's the image that I wanted to start tonight's lecture with. On January the 30th, 1923, the representatives of Turkey and Greece, with the blessing of the world's leading diplomatic powers, put their names to a set of words which would have fateful consequences for nearly 2 million people. This agreement reflected the swift and successful conclusion of one section of a much broader negotiation between the new state of Turkey and the powers which had defeated the Ottoman Empire in 1918. The first article of this newly struck accord reads as follows: "There shall take place a compulsory exchange of Turkish nationals of the Greek Orthodox religion established in Turkish territory and of Greek nationals of the Muslim religion, and these persons shall not return to live in Turkey or Greece, respectively, without the authorization of the Turkish government or the Greek government, respectively." Read with 100 years of hindsight, these words still have a chilling effect. Indeed, they raise hard questions about the very purpose of statehood. Ever since the French and American revolutions, it had seemed to be the case that the very definition of a modern state was one that could claim the loyalty of and offer protection to all citizens regardless of religion. Yet this document appeared to embody the very opposite principle. Even at the time, the signatories and prime movers of this bargain realized that there was something very awkward about transferring people from one country to another because they were, so to speak, of the wrong religion. In an almost comical way, each party tried to blame somebody else for having thought of the idea first. Yet the fact is that all parties very much wanted an agreement of broadly this kind. It was in fact a century ago tomorrow, on December the 1st, 1922, that the idea of a vast swap of religious minorities was first put on the table at the Lausanne Conference. This gathering had been in progress on a Swiss lakeside since October the 20th. To appreciate why, at the time, the idea of a population exchange seemed like an attractive, even a compelling idea, it helps to understand the context of the Lausanne gathering and recall its main participants. In the chair of the conference was the British Foreign Secretary, Lord Curzon, a former Viceroy of India and one of the most charismatic and powerful personalities of the British Empire in its twilight. Throughout his life, he was dogged by a piece of comic verse scribbled by a couple of his Oxford contemporaries. "My name is George Nathaniel Curzon. I am a most superior person." His biggest concern, arriving in Lausanne, was not to be outflanked by his French counterpart, Raymond Poincaré, who, in Lord Curzon's words, was a horrid little man, with whom he had engaged in tearful screaming matches only a few weeks earlier, as these notional allies tried to fine-tune their policy towards Turkey. In the first few days of September, the Turkish nationalist army, commanded by Mustafa Kemal, had gained mastery over Anatolia, after routing the Greek forces which only the previous year had been marching deep inland and threatening the nationalist stronghold of Ankara. The Christian quarters of the great cosmopolitan port of Smyrna, Izmir, lay in ashes. By October, that same army was challenging the British and other Allied troops which were occupying the Straits, enforcing a neutral zone as part of the ongoing legacy of the Great War. The Allies were also present in Constantinople, not quite controlling the city, but offering some protection to its Christian minorities. As confrontation loomed over the Straits, Britain tried unsuccessfully to rally its French and Italian allies, and its own empire, to face down Turkey. But the European allies were unwilling to alienate the new Turkish order, and the British dominions of Australia and Canada also refused London's call to arms. This debacle would lead to the collapse of Britain's ruling coalition and also the downfall of Lloyd George, the stridently pro-Greek Prime Minister. The so-called Chanak crisis is considered a turning point in the history of the British Empire. Amid all this political chaos, Britain and France did manage to strike an armistice deal with the new masters of Turkey, providing for a Greek withdrawal from what we now call European Turkey. In the teeth of French resistance, Britain insisted that the Greek population of eastern Thrace should be given just enough time to flee with their farm animals and wagons, a spectacle that was famously described by Ernest Hemingway. 20 miles of carts drawn by cows, bullocks, and muddy-flanked water buffalo, with exhausted, staggering men, women, and children, blankets over their heads, walking blindly in the rain beside their worldly goods. What Hemingway didn't say was that, in a sense, the refugees from Eastern Thrace were the lucky ones, because they got out with their farm animals and their equipment intact and with families intact. People in most other places were not so lucky. As the Lausanne Conference began, the nationalist forces were quietly, by the day, increasing their influence in the city, which they of course called Istanbul, while the ability of the Allies to control events was steadily ebbing away, pending the full withdrawal that was clearly imminent. The British and French delegations travelled reluctantly on the same train from Paris to Lausanne. There was a rare moment of Anglo-French unity after Curzon and Poincaré were persuaded to interrupt their journey and dine with the Italian Prime Minister, Benito Mussolini. Their host demanded that Britain and France must make a formal acknowledgement of Italy's equal status, a demand that was equally unacceptable to London and Paris. To Curzon's relief, Poincaré left Lausanne after the opening session, leaving the professional diplomats to represent France. Speaking for Greece in Lausanne was Eleftherios Venizelos, a former prime minister who held no formal office, but was still the outstanding personality in the Greek world. Well-connected, witty, and charming, the Cretan politician had championed an assertive strategy in which Greece sided with Britain and France in the Great War in the hope of handsome territorial rewards. Partly through good luck, he could, as of 1922, claim that Greece's greatest diplomatic and military triumphs had been achieved on his watch, whereas Greece's greatest tragedies and disasters had been suffered under his rivals in the conservative monarchist camp. Greece was now in the hands of a so-called revolutionary government of pro-Venizelos officers who had seized power from the discredited monarchists. While he kept in touch with the new masters of Athens, who were his keen supporters, Venizelos enjoyed an international legitimacy which they did not. However, behind the confidence and energy of Venizelos was the knowledge that he was speaking for a country on the brink of state collapse, as it staggered under the impact of a refugee influx equivalent to more than a quarter of its population. At least 1 million Orthodox Christians were in flight from Anatolia, already arrived in Greece or en route. In the ports and islands of Greece, every available space, schools, municipal buildings, theatres, even caves, were packed with desperate people who were glad to have got away with their lives. Speaking for Turkey was İsmet Pasha, one of the commanders of the victorious army, who later became Turkey's second president, taking the surname of İnönü after the location of two of his great victories. His negotiating style oscillated between disarming stubbornness, which he signaled by removing his hearing aid, and unexpected flashes of conciliation. He, of course, consulted closely with Mustafa Kemal, who remained at home. Yet another dominant figure in Lausanne was the Norwegian explorer turned diplomatic troubleshooter, Fridtjof Nansen. Having won fame by crossing Greenland, Nansen had been, since 1921, the High Commissioner for Refugees of the League of Nations. He was awarded the Nobel Prize for helping, and above all, devising a new legal status for millions of people left stateless and starving by the civil war in Russia. As an energetic problem solver, in September 1922, he obtained a fresh mandate to cover the victims of the ultimate round of fighting between Turks and Greeks. In a great tradition of Nordic philanthropists, Nansen was much more than an obedient servant of the great powers. He behaved proactively, declaring in his report to the Lausanne Conference that to unmix the populations of the Near East will secure the pacification of the Near East. With sharp-eyed realism, he added that from the political and psychological point of view, it would be best to carry out the exchange immediately, amidst the fluidity created by a sense of ongoing crisis. The Americans played no formal role in the Lausanne talks. They were not members of the League of Nations, and they had not fought the Ottoman Empire. But the quiet efforts of American observers probably helped to fashion some of the details of the population exchange. Very broadly, Mustafa Kemal and Ismet Pasha had made clear that there was little or no room for what they regarded as treacherous Christian minorities in the new Turkey which they were constructing. But they wanted the departure of the Christian minorities to be legitimate and part of an internationally agreed procedure. Venizelos spoke for a state that was already facing an almost unmanageable influx of destitute newcomers. The departure of Greece's Muslim residents, in particular those living in the northern regions which had only quite recently come under Greek sovereignty, would provide space, both economically and physically, for the Greek Orthodox refugees to settle. The Turkish side seemed willing to absorb the Muslim residents of Greece as promising demographic material for the republic that they were bent on creating. Indeed, by the logic of the era, the Turkish willingness to take in the Greek Muslim population was a kind of peace gesture. It signaled that Turkey did not have further territorial claims on its neighbor, and therefore had no reason to keep in place people who, in their view, might have acted as fifth columnists. Having endured some galling blows to Britain in the previous weeks, Lord Curzon very much wanted the Lausanne Conference to be a success. His biggest priorities were freedom of navigation through the Straits and the upholding of Britain's protectorate over the oil fields of northern Iraq. Perhaps to the surprise of the French and Italians, there was a kind of grudging respect between Lord Curzon and the Turks in the early weeks of the conference, but it was fragile. The Turks suspected, perhaps not wrongly, that when Lord Curzon spoke out in defense of the Christian minorities, his real purpose was to put pressure on Turkey on other fronts. Broadly, the European powers wanted to preserve the economic privileges which they had enjoyed in the final part of the Ottoman era, and the new Turkish government was determined to assert its sovereignty. There was, in fact, some overlap between these economic questions and humanitarian concerns. Foreign-owned firms working in Turkey relied heavily on the services of well-educated local Christians, and so the mass expulsion of those Christians would have consequences for those foreign-owned firms. Such was the political, economic, and human context of the Lausanne gathering. The proposal for a population exchange was, as we have seen, formally put on the table exactly a century ago tomorrow. It was introduced by Lord Curzon, but its terms had been fine-tuned by Nansen. The parties immediately started bargaining intensively, not over the principle of the exchange, which they all sneakily accepted, but rather over the details. Would it be compulsory or voluntary? And what exceptions, if any, would be allowed? Venizelos responded to the proposal by saying that he was willing to consider, in principle, either a voluntary exchange of populations or an obligatory one. In very truth, Venizelos was not merely open to the idea, he actually wanted it to happen as soon as it possibly could. Like everybody in Greece or involved with Greece, he could see that there was an urgent need to resettle the newcomers rapidly and make sure that no more harvests were missed. For hundreds of thousands of people, this could make the difference between living or starving. And in practice, this meant settling the newcomers on houses and farms. And there was a simple answer to the question of where that property could be found. The departure of the Muslim population, mostly in Greek Macedonia and Thrace, would provide an elegant solution to that problem. However, there was an important rider. To quote from a statement issued in Athens a month earlier, the Hellenic government could not contemplate taking into Greece the enormous Greek population of Constantinople, or admit the principle that the Turks should expel it. That was in direct contradiction of the position taken by the new Turkish authorities, who had informed Nansen on October the 31st that they were prepared to negotiate only on the base of a total compulsory exchange, with no exception for the Queen of Cities. In fact, between October and December 1922, some 50,000 members of religious minorities in that city, mostly Greek Christians, decided to take no chances, and they fled the shores of the Bosphorus. So the stage was set for a tense diplomatic game of poker, not over the basic principle of a population exchange, which everybody wanted while pretending not to want, but rather over its precise scope and terms. Lord Curzon showed some sympathy for the Greek position, saying that for the Queen of Cities, the Greek population is vital to the existence of Constantinople as a great centre of commerce and industry. Indeed, without it, Constantinople would be in danger of losing its authority, wealth, and trade. But on December the 13th, Ismet Pasha appeared to up the ante by insisting not only on the expulsion of the Istanbul Greeks, but on an exemption for Muslims in Greek Thrace, that part of Greece which is closest to the new land border with Turkey. In fact, this outburst of maximalism turned out to be a smokescreen for an emerging bargain. Turkey would, in the end, tolerate the presence of Greek Orthodox Christians in its greatest city, albeit defining the category very narrowly, but only in return for the retention of a comparable number of Muslims in Greek Thrace, a little over 100,000 people in both countries. At least as much diplomatic heat was generated by an ancient spiritual institution which had functioned on the Bosphorus for more than 16 centuries, the Patriarchate of Constantinople. Such was the emotional resonance of this question that it could easily have provoked fresh conflict between Greece and Turkey. Although Orthodox Christianity has no vertical structure comparable to the Vatican, the Patriarchate of Constantinople has, for historic reasons, enjoyed a primacy of honor in the Eastern Christian world. Its potential expulsion was horrifying to many Orthodox countries, including Serbia, Bulgaria, and Romania. It also troubled the leaders of the Anglican Church, who in those days had considerable influence. A background factor was the Anglicans' belief that the Patriarch formed a useful counterweight to the Vatican in the contest for influence over the Christians of the East. Indeed, the Archbishop of Canterbury had privately warned Curzon that removing the Patriarchate might actually be welcomed in the Vatican. And this, the English prelate said, was reason enough for Britain to protect the ancient Orthodox institution. On January the 4th, the Turkish delegation, in the person of Rize Nur, a very sharp-tongued military doctor, renewed his country's demands for the expulsion of the Patriarchate from its home city as a precondition for allowing any of its adherents to remain in their homes. But on this question again, a bargain was being hammered out behind the scenes. As early as December 26th, France had floated a compromise under which the Patriarchate could stay in place, but only if it renounced its worldly role as administrator of the Christians' earthly affairs. As negotiations restarted on January the 10th, the two sides seemed entrenched. Ismet Pasha reaffirmed the country's insistence on removing the Patriarchate, a move which Lord Curzon said would deliver a shock to the conscience of the entire civilized world. Half an hour later, Ismet changed position and gave a verbal undertaking that the ancient Christian see could remain in place as long as it stuck only to spiritual tasks. This was not a perfect outcome for Greece or Britain or other historically Christian countries, and the fact that the pledge was purely verbal left the Patriarchate in a precarious position. But this hard-won compromise has certainly had consequences for the Christian world ever since. Under its present incumbent, Bartholomeus I, the Patriarchate has gained enormous international prestige as an advocate of interfaith reconciliation and of care for the planet. One other issue gaped open at the start of 1923. That was the fate of the Cappadocian Christians living deep inside Anatolia and far from any war zone. Devout practitioners of Greek Orthodoxy, but mostly using Turkish in their everyday lives. Oddly enough, there seemed at the beginning of January to be a general view among all parties, the Greeks, the Turks, Lord Curzon, that this community, numbering about 50,000, should be allowed to stay in its home. But when the population deal was finally struck, a few weeks later, the devout Cappadocians were clearly included. As it turned out in the end, this was the only category of Orthodox Christians in Anatolia who were marched away from their homes, not in chaotic war conditions, but in the orderly and cold-blooded way, under the eyes of the League of Nations, which diplomatic theory had laid down. Such broadly is the background to the convention concerning the exchange of the Greek and Turkish populations signed in January 1923. It is a document worth studying. Its second article provides an exemption from the compulsory exchange of the Greek inhabitants of Constantinople and the Muslim inhabitants of Western Thrace. People who had left their homes already were deemed to be included in the exchange. Exchanged people were free to bring movable assets, but their immovable property, in other words, houses and land, would be liquidated under the authority of a mixed commission to be established by the Greek and Turkish governments and the League of Nations. This commission was empowered to supervise and facilitate all aspects of the exchange, including the eventual compensation of the exchangees in accordance with the declared value of the property they had left behind. That part of the bargain was never fulfilled. For good reason, Venizelos had done his best to put the population deal on a fast track, ahead of all the other issues in Lausanne. But in the end, he was not able to ring-fence the population deal. Negotiations at Lausanne broke down in early February 1923, and they did not resume until mid-April, and the full-blown Lausanne Treaty, governing all aspects of Turkey's relations with the wider world, was signed only on the 24th of July 1923. Only at that point could the population exchange formally proceed, though to a large extent it was proceeding already. The deportation of the Muslim population of Greece began in the final weeks of 1923, and it was completed within a year. Most left by ship from Thessaloniki, some made the short journey from the island of Lesbos to the adjacent coast, other boatloads left the ports of Crete, where 40,000 or so, mainly Greek-speaking Muslims, were among the least willing participants in the exchange. This Muslim exodus and the story of the exchangees' reception in Turkey is a saga in itself, which merits another lecture of at least an hour. So sometime this year, whether by video or physically, I undertake to give that lecture. I hope you and the Muslim exchangees and their progeny will forgive me if I devote the remainder of tonight's lecture to the consequences of the population exchange, human, economic, and cultural, for Greece. As early as October 1922, Venizelos had accurately foreseen that humanitarian aid from the United States would be decisive in enabling Greece to cope with the influx of newcomers. As Venizelos said, Europe has been sorely worn out by the convulsions through which she has gone in the last decade, and is perhaps too worn out to cast more than an apathetic glance at the mass of suffering. And so it is to America that we chiefly turn, and indeed America has responded magnificently to our appeal. Between October 1922 and the following June, the American Red Cross organized a relief operation that made history, spending a total of $2.6 million. As of March 1923, 530 refugees were receiving daily food supplies, and nearly 300,000 had been inoculated against the typhus and cholera, which were taking a terrible toll. This was a lean and efficient operation, involving no more than 45 American staff who worked closely with their Greek colleagues and empowered local Greek agencies. However, from the very beginning of 1923, both the American Red Cross and the State Department became almost obsessed with the idea that emergency aid to Greece could not continue indefinitely, and indeed this short-term relief must give way as soon as possible to resettlement and rehabilitation, a job that must fall to others. They were adamant that the aid would stop in June 1923, and that determination probably cost some lives. Other parties understood this imperative too, and long before the population exchange was formally ratified, deliberations were in progress at the League of Nations about how to secure the long-term future of the refugees in Greece with the help of international credit. In America's absence, Britain was the leading power in the League of Nations. It provided a great deal of the League's bureaucratic backbone. But that did not prevent individual Americans from playing a substantial, indeed pivotal role, none more so than Henry Morgantown. Born in Germany to a Jewish family which moved to America when he was 10, Morgantown was one of the last American envoys to the Ottoman Empire. He did not hide his warm feelings for the empire's Christian minorities, empathizing with their agonizing travails and also voicing great admiration for their business acumen and drive to succeed and gain education. He played a central role in the negotiations which led to the establishment in Greece of a refugee settlement commission, which functioned on the understanding that the chairman would be American, and in practice that was Morgantown himself. His deputy would be from another country, in practice British, and the two other commissioners would be Greek. It was a more or less happy example of international bureaucratic cooperation. On the first day in November 1923, when the commission met to deliberate, Henry Morgantown took some time off to visit the port of Thessaloniki and observe the human realities of the problem that they were trying to cope with. As Morgantown recalled, I went down to the harbour and I saw a shipload of refugees land. A more tragic sight could hardly be imagined. I saw 7,000 people crowded in a ship that would have been taxed to normal capacity with 2,000. They were packed like sardines upon the deck, a writhing mass of human misery. They had been at sea for 4 days. Many had stood on the open deck, drenched by autumn rain, pierced by night wind. They came ashore in rags, hungry, sick, covered with vermin, bowed with despair. I, at that moment, pledged to redeem this throng. What an awful responsibility. How could I dare to fail them when my failure meant a deeper misery to these people? But Morgantown was not by temperament a man to wallow in despair. His other reminiscences of that period strongly emphasized the determination of the newcomers to get down to useful work and improve their family's status as soon as possible. Quiet mediation by Morgantown between the financial elites of London and New York and the political elites of Athens helped to smooth the way for a refugee loan of £10 million sterling, followed by a top-up in 1928 of another 7.5 million. As Morgantown explains in his memoirs, one of the preconditions for raising this money through an international bond issue was the existence of collateral, and that was provided in part by the property, the houses and farms of the Muslims who left Greece. So the population exchange had a deadly, inexorable financial logic as well as a human and geopolitical one. With equal frankness, Morgantown told his Greek friends that the adoption of a republican system of government, as opposed to the unpopular monarchy, would make a great difference to the nation's creditworthiness. It seemed as though the high and mighty of the world wanted Greece to be stable, prosperous, and territorially satisfied within existing borders. The bondholders were neither monarchists nor republicans, but they did make calculations about stability, and they apparently saw the latter form of government as the more stabilizing one for Greece. The RSC functioned well. By 1926, this is the office of the RSC in Athens, they had installed more than 620,000 newcomers in permanent situations, whether on land or in towns. They were, at least in theory, economically self-supporting. This was an impressive achievement, but it left almost as many newcomers in desperate need of accommodation and work. The use of international credit seems to have been generally efficient. The commission was dissolved in December 1930, by which time 600,000 small plots of land had been parcelled out to the refugees. The Greek government had a more modest resettlement program of its own, which continued after the international agency's dissolution. So by 1938, about 700,000 refugee families were living on newly provided farms. The social consequences of this settlement are still very much palpable in northern Greece. For anyone travelling around, say, Greek Macedonia, it is easily possible to identify which villages were settled by which population groups. Some from eastern Thrace, some from the Black Sea district, some from Cappadocia. In the early years of settlement, the distinctions between these groups, and also between them as a whole and the pre-existing population, were keenly felt. One vivid memory I have of traveling around Greek Macedonia is going to a village near Grevina, and a lady in the village said, referring to the next village, "From that village we never took and we never gave." Now, I was expected to understand what it was that they didn't take and what they didn't give, and the answer was brides. We didn't give brides to that village and we didn't take brides, and that reflects the quite deep and salient social divisions between different categories of refugees and also the refugees as a whole and the so-called dopi, the pre-existing population. Both the Greek and international authorities concentrated on agricultural resettlement, even if that meant planting some newcomers on land they did not want. There were strategic and pragmatic reasons for this. From the Greek government's point of view, the newcomers helped to populate the lands of Greek Macedonia and Thrace with people who, regardless of what language or dialect they might have spoken, certainly aspired to be Greek and nothing but Greek. One of the most spectacular consequences of the resettlement was the expansion of the carpet industry, of which more anon. Carpet production, in fact, increased from 68,000 square meters in 1925 to nearly 200,000 in 1928. Americans who had helped the relief effort, whether by making contributions or simply by buying bonds, were assured in the pages of the American press that their money was being well used. Here is a breezy press report planted in a newspaper in Utah by the Near East Relief, one of the American agencies. Near East Relief points out that the 1.3 million refugees in Greece, for whose relief and assistance America has spent nearly $10 million, are already becoming an essential economic factor in the life of the new country. The refugee problem came upon Greece with the suddenness of a great national disaster, and it probably would have wrecked the country except for the financial assistance and counsel which was brought into the emergency by American aid. Today, more than half the refugees are self-supporting. The future of Greece will be profoundly affected by these refugees, as well as the friendly attitude of America towards Greece. No real American would confess that when he gave $1 to help a starving child, he had done so for the purpose of making money. But it is interesting to note that our charitable investments in the Near East have frequently been followed by commercial developments, the result of friendships and new interests established in the countries where our relief work was carried on. In 1929, the British politician, a former Liberal MP turned international civil servant, Sir John Hope Simpson, gave a sweeping and fairly objective account of the work of the Refugee Settlement Commission. It is revealing for what it claims and revealing for what it does not claim. As he recalled, the Commission had devoted the bulk of its resources, 90% of the initial loan of £10 million, to agricultural rather than urban resettlement. This made sense, he observed, in view of the need to increase agricultural production as fast as possible, both to feed the newcomers and to feed the nation as a whole. It was also desirable, in Hope Simpson's words, to avoid the congregation in the towns of large masses of population. In plainer language, even pro-Venizelos governments, which could broadly count on support from the refugees, understood that an underemployed urban proletariat could easily become a destabilizing factor in Greece's fragile polity. Hope Simpson presents the agricultural settlement, mainly in northern Greece, as a resounding success. I quote, "The factors of the problem were, on one hand, the area of land, and on the other, a group of refugees. The land, in many cases, virgin soil, unbroken by the plough. The refugees without housing accommodation, without agricultural implements, without cattle, without seeds, and without the wherewithal to maintain life. The loan was used quite efficiently, it seems, to provide the would-be farmers with all those things. A plough animal was provided for each family. A plough itself had to be shared between 2 families, and a cart by 4 families. Motorized ploughs made their appearance in the form of reparations from Germany. The task was easiest when the Commission found itself redistributing land and houses which had indeed been abandoned by departing Muslims, or indeed Bulgarians who had left under the smaller population exchange of 1919. Things were harder when the land consisted of former monastic estates which had been used sporadically for grazing by peripatetic herders. Another category of land consisted of reclaimed marshes. By draining, irrigating, and digging artesian wells, the Commission fostered a vast improvement in the efficiency of farming across northern Greece. Grain output for Greece as a whole rose impressively as a result. Production of a broad range of cereals nearly doubled between 1923 and 1928, and imports of wheat fell correspondingly. The Commission introduced Australian wheat, which was resistant to heat and drought, along with American vines, which were immune from the terrible disease of phylloxera. The Commission also successfully fostered fruit growing, including apples, as well as mulberries and tobacco. All this was achieved despite the tiny size of the plots that were handed out, an average holding of 3.5 hectares. It probably worked best when an entire pre-existing community, representing a small village somewhere deep in Anatolia, was allowed to resettle en masse in a new location, preserving the social relationships, the form of speech, the religious cults of the former homeland. One problem, as I've mentioned, was tension between the newcomers and the pre-existing population. In quite a few cases, departing Muslim farmers, instead of simply giving up their land, had sold it on knockdown terms to their indigenous Greek neighbours. Now, under the terms of the Convention on Population Exchange, such sales were absolutely banned. It had been declared that people affected by the exchange would not only lose their nationality and their right to live in the country, but they would also lose their immovable property, on the understanding that some adequate substitute would be provided on arrival in the new country. Citing these harsh conditions in the Lausanne Convention, the Commission claimed that any sales of former Muslim land to local neighbours were null and void, but those neighbours could indeed challenge this provision in the court, and they had some success in doing so. An interesting detail is that in mapping out and distributing land in northern Greece, an important role was played by white Russian refugees, people in flight from the Bolsheviks. Hope Simpson refers gratefully to the considerable number of Russian ex-officers who were expert surveyors and whose work and devotion was beyond all praise. With regard to urban settlements, the picture is much more mixed. As Hope Simpson said, the Commission would soon, as of 1929, have completed the building of 27,000 dwellings for refugees, matching a similar number erected by the government. The Commission's construction effort in Athens and Piraeus alone amounted to nearly 12,000 dwellings. But it had to be admitted that the theory on which the whole construction effort was based, in other words, a delicate rectangular relationship between the League of Nations, the bondholders, the Greek government, and the refugees, had often broken down. As Hope Simpson explained, under contracts signed by the occupants, a rent was charged which would result in the habitation becoming the property of the occupant within 15 years. Now, in principle, that sounds like an excellent arrangement. However, as Hope Simpson explained, when houses were completed, they were invaded by large numbers of families, largely in excess of the accommodation, with the result that in certain of the settlements, many habitations contain one family in each room, and most contain more than one family. A further difficulty, as Hope Simpson explained, had arisen from organised resistance to making any payment at all. All sorts of excuses are advanced: poverty, the existence of claims against the government, the inadequacy of the accommodation, allegations that the houses had not really cost what they were being charged, and objections to any charge for the works of public utility, such as roads, water, and light. As Hope Simpson said, we can, of course, have recourse to the government to help us, but the refugees are in a very strong position vis-à-vis the government, as each family possesses a vote, and there is always an election in prospect. Hope Simpson goes on to exonerate Venizelos, who resumed office as Prime Minister in 1928, from playing populist games with the refugees, but he was not so kind about other Greek governments. So much for the bureaucratic viewpoint. But what was the experience closer to the ground, literally closer to the ground, closer to the muddy earth? For example, in the district of Podorades, which was a well-watered and well-situated location on the north side of Athens, which was chosen as one of the focal points of refugee settlement in the capital. Under its new name of Nea Ionia, this district was one of the 4 districts in Greater Athens that was chosen by the Refugee Settlement Commission to focus its building efforts. In recent months, I've had the pleasure of getting to know some local historians in Nea Ionia, and I would like to thank my new friends Vassos and Olga Verzoglu and Lucas Christodoulou. The story of Nea Ionia, initially called Nea Pisivia, is a remarkable tale which initially involved just a few hundred families from the Turkish town of Isparta, more than 300 kilometers east of the Aegean. Isparta was and remains a place famous for the production of a particular style of hand-woven carpet, woven by the nimble fingers of women and girls. The migrants from Isparta had been led by heroic priest Papaioakim Besmazoglu, one of the many clerics who shared in the sufferings of their flock and helped to shepherd them to a fresh life in Greece. And you can be sure that Papaioakim lobbied vigorously on behalf of his people, keenly aware that their carpet-making skills had actually made them a potential asset. They were not simply a drain on the Greek state's resources. It is worth pausing for a moment to observe that one of the characteristics of the Greek Orthodox refugees of the 1920s is that they were much more religiously devout than the pre-existing population of Greece. The icons and holy relics which they brought from their homelands were the most precious items that they possessed, valuable tokens of family or community life and pathways to the divine. Indeed, one recurring feature in reminiscences of these new arrivals is that they were shocked to hear on the streets of Athens people speaking blasphemy about the saints or the Virgin Mary. These newcomers were also socially conservative, having great respect for the institution of marriage. If you read the memoirs of the newly canonized monastic saint, Osios Iakovos Tselikis, he recalls arriving with his mother and grandmother in Paris in 1924, and I'll say the following words in Greek. He said, «Ακούσαμε για πρώτη φορά κάποιον να βλασφημάει τα θεία. Και είπε η γιαγιά μου, καλύτερα να γυρίσουμε στην Τουρκία, να μας σκοτώσουν οι Τούρκοι, παρά να ακούσουμε τέτοια λόγια». In other words, we arrived in Athens and we heard people blaspheming holy things. And my grandmother said, it's better to go back to Turkey and be killed by the Turks than to hear such words. So the newcomers were people who took very seriously the rituals of marriage. They regarded divorce as unthinkable. And it soon became clear this very deep-rooted piety did not imply deference to the rich or to earthly powers. These new arrivals could be very radical in politics as well as being deeply religious. In fact, to this day, the parts of Greater Athens where refugees settled tend to have 2 seemingly contradictory characteristics: a high left-wing vote and also a high incidence of church-going. The formal laying of the foundation stone of the new settlement of Pisivia, Nea Pisivia, then Nea Ionia, took place on June the 30th, 1923, with the leaders of the revolutionary government, Generals Plastiras and Gonatas, prominently in view. This was clearly a settlement of strategic importance. Then 6 months later, what you see here, on December the 9th, there was a second ceremony, this time attended by Henry Morgantown as president of the Refugee Settlement Commission and his British deputy, Sir John Campbell. Also prominently in view was Apostolos Doxiadis, who, as Minister of Social Welfare, had done remarkable work to marshal Greece's resources and to facilitate the work of foreign agencies. Doxiadis made an emotional speech about the work which had been done even since June, in large measure thanks to local efforts. About 400 houses had already been built, each accommodating one family, although that still left many others living in tents and huts. Praising Papaioakim, Doxiadis declared that only a few months ago, this very priest was standing in this very spot, emptiness all around. But he spoke in a spirit of hope and promise, hope that this would become a home for the future. And that hope is becoming a reality, Thanks to this township, which is arising out of the blood and tears that we shed in Asia Minor and Thrace, and from the sweat of our brow. Doxadis was conscious of being a newcomer to Greece himself. His family had originated near Philippopolis, Plovdiv in Bulgaria. But in such a chaotic situation, these upbeat sentiments could not endure very long. Within a year or so, Papa Joachim was complaining bitterly that refugees from many different places were being assigned to his fiefdom, and so it was losing its character as a hive of carpet-making skill. The government retorted that it had little choice, as the refugees currently camped out in school buildings had to be accommodated somewhere if school life was to restart. Both individually and collectively, the refugees became rapidly more assertive in defense of their own interests. The Commission insisted that under its own mandate, it had no choice but to collect a modest rent from the families it was housing, amounting to, say, 80 or 100 drachmas a month for a room of 14 square meters. The refugees, under increasingly well-organized leaders, retorted that it was the duty of the Greek government to house them, and indeed to transfer to them property corresponding to what they had left behind in Turkey. That was the promise of Lausanne. In May 1925, there was a demonstration by thousands of refugees from near Ionia and the other refugee settlements in which slogans were chanted against the International Commission. This unleashed a protest movement that was well coordinated between the four main refugee districts, namely Ionia, Virona, Kesariani, and Kokkinia in Paris. Weeks later, a seemingly well-orchestrated movement of advocacy for the refugees, grouping people from all over Athens, was denouncing the absurd and impractical ideas of the Refugee Settlement Commission, in particular its demands for rent or, in effect, mortgage payments from people who should be entitled to free housing. They mastered Katharevousa quite well, considering their situation. As victims of the Asia Minor catastrophe, materially ruined and morally dejected, the refugees were tormented and made to suffer every sort of woe before they managed in some fashion or other to meet their most immediate need, which was that of housing. It was claimed that refugees in the four areas taken up by the Commission were actually in a worse situation than the others because they were abandoned by the state and they were facing threats of eviction from the dreaded Commission if they did not pay their monthly rent. Still, none of these woes prevented the carpet industry from flourishing. In fact, it was increasing by leaps and bounds. The skills were abundant, the economic need was desperate, and the demand for beautifully made Oriental rugs was keen, especially in the United States. Whatever its reputation on the ground, the Refugee Settlement Commission had certainly done its bit to promote the sector by offering sites on favorable terms. But success brought contention. As emerges from the files of the Refugee Settlement Commission, which are in Geneva but can now be viewed digitally, Sir John Hope Simpson found himself being lobbied intensively by various Greek interests to promote a new national carpet company that would counter the influence of the New York-based firms that were allegedly dominating the trade and fixing prices. The lobbyists' argument was that despite the appearance of success, the carpet trade was really in crisis. A mere 10,000 refugee women were engaged in it, and at least another 20,000 had the skills, so only some enlightened protectionism would correct the situation, so the argument went. Hope Simpson was unconvinced. He thought that such initiatives would alienate the international carpet trade, driving them to seek supplies from other countries, and it would go far beyond his mandate. In 1929, this whole discussion suddenly became irrelevant as the Wall Street crash wiped out the American demand for carpets. But that did not prevent the continuing development of Nea Ionia as a center for general textile production, carding and spinning wool, spinning and weaving cotton on an enormous scale. A striking feature of this accelerating textile boom in Nea Ionia and elsewhere in Athens is that it combined the entrepreneurial skill and networks of wealthy Asia Minor Greeks with the willing hands of refugee labor. Indeed, it could be said that one of the most palpable effects of the influx from Asia Minor was to endow Greece with a new bourgeoisie and a new proletariat. The prestige of Nea Ionia as the Manchester of Greece flourished anew even after the Second World War. Indeed, it went on flourishing until Greece joined the European community in 1981, which had paradoxical consequences. On one hand, the EEC subsidized cotton production, but the manufacturing of textiles ceased to be viable in the competitive world of the EEC, and the factories gradually emptied and became architectural landmarks instead. One, named after the town of Mutalaski in the deep interior of Turkey, where the factory's founders had originated, became the headquarters of the administration of the 2004 Olympic Games. In any case, textiles, while they lasted, served as a major accelerator of the Greek economy and one of the significant economic consequences of the refugee influx. What about the other consequences? What about the consequences in the realm, for example, of popular culture? Now, I asked Lukas Christodoulou, one of the historians of Ionia, what were the factors that helped to build bridges, if you like, between this community and Athens as a whole. Bear in mind that in the very early years of the refugee settlements, the Greek state would have been hardly present except through police. You know, the gendarmes were almost the only people from the Greek state who would have set foot in the 4 hardcore refugee settlements. So I asked how this situation had changed and how gradual strands of connection had emerged between the refugee settlements and Greater Athens as a whole. And my friend had a very precise and concise answer. He said it happened chronologically through 3 factors. Football, the emergence of local teams like Ionia, which actually still plays in the Greek First Division, and lesser ones, Eleftheropoulos, seen here. Then the popularity of musicians who would give concerts to support the embryonic sports clubs. And finally, food. At these concerts, women from the community would offer tasty, simple Asia Minor dishes, the equivalent of street food. So in those 3 ways, football, music, and food, the refugees gradually began to penetrate the mainstream popular culture of the Greater Athens conurbation. What about the political consequences of the refugee influx? Now, for the first few years after the refugees' arrival, that would have seemed a very simple question indeed. The newcomers were overwhelmingly loyal to Venizelos and consequently viewed with suspicion or indeed hostility by the monarchist camp. But then in 1930, Venizelos made a grand financial settlement with Turkey as part of a broader rapprochement and diplomatic alliance, which left the refugees very disappointed. Many refugees had hoped that they would either get substantial compensation for what they had left behind, or else they would be able, by some miracle, to return to their homelands. The agreements of 1930 made it clear that they had no hope in the immediate future of receiving either benefit. Now, this did not lead to an immediate collapse in support for Venizelos among the refugees, but it did mean that political parties of the left and right were free to pursue the refugee vote and have some success in doing so. This trend can be seen in the municipal politics of Athens. During the 1930s, one of the city's leading conservative, indeed ultra-conservative figures was Konstantinos Kotsias, first as mayor of the city and then as minister in the government of Metaxas, who took power in 1936. Kotsias gained power in part through an electoral trick, which involved detaching the refugee districts from the municipality, and hence neutralizing the liberal sympathies of the refugees. So you might think that he was a demon figure for the refugees. But on the contrary, in fact, Kotsias courted the sympathy of the refugees, and the consequences of that are still palpable on Alexandros Avenue in Athens, a housing development which is now very dilapidated, but would have seemed at the time as the absolute last word in modernist multi-story building when erected in the early 30s. Much has been written, and indeed correctly written, about the cleavage between native Greeks and refugees, which exacerbated some of the country's pre-existing social and ideological divisions. The very fact that some Christian refugees used Turkish as an everyday language was exaggerated by ill-wishers to imply that all refugees were speakers of an alien tongue. It would be an exaggeration to call the early refugee quarters ghettos, but perhaps not completely absurd exaggeration. When Renée Hirschhorn made her historic research into the district of Coquigny in the early 70s, in other words, 50 years after the exchange, she still found a population that was intensely conscious of its Asia Minor memories, a population that was conscious of a certain superiority, as they saw it, in their material culture, in their social capital, to outsiders, to people who preferred to marry among themselves. So that difference, that sense of cleavage, remained at least for 50 years. But the other fact is that in October 1940, when the nation set off to war against the Italians in Albania, it did so as a united country. Old Greeks and refugees marched to the front together, and this would not have been possible if there had not been a certain convergence, or at least the beginnings of a convergence, between the newcomers and the pre-existing Greek population. Whatever the snobbish disdain of established Athenians for the refugee quarters, strands of connection were being formed. And that is how things happen in great cities unless something is done actively to prevent that happening. I'd probably be stating the obvious, talking now about high culture rather than popular culture. I'd probably be stating the obvious if I said that in the mid-20th century, the dominant trend in poetry and in prose in Greece comes from what you might call the East Aegean. If you include the island of Mytilene and the adjacent mainland, that's where a remarkable number of the novelists and poets of Greece came from. But I'd like to develop that thought in my final remarks just a little bit further, a little bit provocatively. One of the ironies of the cultural history of modern Greece is that in the 1920s and 30s, the role of Athens, its antiquities, and the Acropolis in particular, were thrown into sharper relief thanks to the artistic talents and rich imagination of newcomers who were not from Athens. In fact, they were from Greek Constantinople or from other parts of Asia Minor. It was, of course, for his poetry that George Seferis was awarded the Nobel Prize in 1963. Not many people know about the one and only novel that he penned in fits and starts. Perhaps not his greatest work. In any case, 6 Nights on the Acropolis tells the story of young Athenians connected by a web of friendship and desire who gather under the Parthenon as it was bathed in a lunar glow. It was not very successful as a novel. There are probably good reasons why he stuck to poetry, but it seemed to have worked better when it was remade as a performance, which was actually seen here at the Hellenic Centre in 2018. It has been observed in this work that the moonlight is a character in her own right, along with the exiled Caryatid, who was spirited away to the British Museum. At a minimum, the existence of this work tells you what was on the literary giant's mind as his family settled in the Plaka. He was not just mourning the lost homelands of Asia Minor, he was also learning to love and wrestle with the mysteries of his new Athenian home. It was in 1929 that the Greek National Tourist Organization, EOT, was founded, with a mission to promote both the country's natural beauty and its splendid antiquities, beginning with the Parthenon. In this enterprise, the talent of newcomers from Asia Minor certainly played a very important role. In 1939, the daring artistic photographer known as Nelly was put in charge of designing the Greek stand at a global tourism fair in New York. Her designs and her photos were a roaring success. She had already won fame or notoriety by photographing skimpily clad dancers as they made elegant leaps around the columns of the Parthenon. Nelly, whose real name was Eli Soyuzoglu Seradari, was among the glories of Greek artistic achievement before and around the time of just before the Second World War, shall we say. I mean, her own appearance was quite conventional, but her cultural products were anything but conventional. One final thing. One of the glories of modern Greek culture before the war, even during the war, were performances of classical drama, both tragedy and above all comedy, in or near the very locations where they were first enjoyed. Bawdy farces like Lysistrata, the story of women who campaigned for peace by denying their husbands sex, apparently based on the real-life figure of a priestess who controlled the holiest places on the Acropolis, or political slapstick like the Iconians, featuring a farmer citizen who is bored with warmongering politicians, but nonetheless turns up grudgingly to play his part in the democratic assembly. These works actually bring us into the life of ancient Athens like nothing else does. The rediscovery of these works and their presentation literally in the shadow of the Acropolis marked a new history, a new juncture in the history of that monument, a monument which only a century earlier had been an Ottoman garrison, densely populated by soldiers and civilians. And in the reflowering of this 2,500-year-old theatrical tradition, actors, stage designers, writers, and directors from Greek Asia Minor played a vital role. I can't help mentioning the name of one individual, the director Carlos Kuhn, who was born in Prusa, or Bursa, educated in Greek Constantinople, but made his mark in Athens. Here's one of his productions. Here's another. There's an irony here, I think. Ever since the foundation of Constantinople as the capital of the East Roman Empire, the Greek world has had two contenders to be the ultimate reference point in the heritage of Hellenism, Athens and Constantinople. For the first century or so of Greek independence, the new nation's leader had ambivalent feelings, to put it mildly, about where the epicenter of their nation really was to be found. In fact, many thought that Athens was no more than a temporary capital, pending the creation of who knows what, a Neo-Byzantine empire, a Greek-Turkish condominium, in any case, something that would happen on the shores of the Bosphorus and not in Attica. With the near collapse of Greek Constantinople, the entrepreneurs, the bankers, the engineers, the teachers, the footballers, the actors, the artists, a great deal of that city's energy, that city's Greek energy, flowed straight into Athens. And that finally raises the question. One more production by Carlos Kuhn. He was active as a teacher at Athens College in the 30s, and from the 50s onwards, he was putting on performances in the Herodes Atticus Theatre, in Epidavros, one of the great theatre directors of Europe in the 20th century. And in conclusion, I'd like to ask the open question whether the details of the Lausanne negotiations actually matter today in the light of what actually happened. So much energy was devoted to the preservation of Greek Constantinople, which in fact dwindled close to vanishing point through a series of hammer blows. There was the wealth tax in the 1940s, the anti-Greek riots of 1955, and the de facto expulsions of 1964. That's one thing. On the other hand, the survival of the Patriarchate by a kind of diplomatic miracle has proved to have enduring consequences for the entire Christian world. The Muslims who were transferred to Turkey retain their distinctive family memories, even some knowledge of Greek, but they are now deeply integrated into the Turkish Republic. For the present generation of Greeks, the Asia Minor heritage, its distinctive customs, its forms of speech, its religious devotion form a rich family heirloom, but they are hardly a cause of separation from the Greek mainstream. And to that extent, the calculation of the Lausanne negotiators and the state builders of Greece and Turkey proved, you might say, correct. In a part of the world where religion was an irreducibly salient factor in human affairs, a common religious heritage would assist the transition to a more or less secular nation-state. But the price paid for achieving that commonality of religion was horribly high. One of the frankest assessments of the population transfer was actually made by Lord Curzon. He said, "I believe that an exchange of population, however well it were carried out, must impose considerable hardships, perhaps very considerable impoverishment, on great numbers of individual citizens of the two countries. But I also believe that these hardships, great though they may be, will be less than the hardships which will result for those same populations if nothing is done." Now, whether he was correct in that gloomy assessment, that gloomy counterfactual, is of course something we will never know.